assuming that someone is watching this and they've never met you before and they're not going to watch everything, and this 3 minutes that you say is the only interaction you're going to ever have with them, what is it you want to say? It's all around the world. People watch these videos all into the future. What is it that you want to say to someone that is giving you 3 minutes to sum up everything important you know in this world that you want to tell them? If you have 3 minutes to say the most focused, important, and urgent information that you want to make sure they understand. It's seen by men, women, young and old, in 110 countries. So if you each give an some opening thoughts, 3-minute opening thoughts. Starting here would be great.
Well, thank you for having me. What I'd just really like to say is that climate change is something that's real. We have understood the basic physics between anthropogenic climate change for really a century, more than a century. Really smart guy, Svante Arrhenius, back in 1896, predicted that as carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere rise, the climate will warm. He also said that the change would be most pronounced in the polar regions. And he wasn't quite right because it was really the Arctic, but he pretty much had it spot on. We're seeing that today. The thing is, we can beat this. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take society really coming together on this problem, but I think that we can beat it. And what I think I also need to stress is how hard the scientists are working on these sorts of problems and understanding the problem. My book, Brave New Arctic, talks about how scientists came together from all over the world to understand the big changes going on in the Arctic and what they mean. And what I tried to get across in this book is that scientists are people too. We're very passionate about what we do. We're not in it for the money. I don't know many scientists at all who have become rich becoming scientists. You hear some people talk about fat government contracts that scientists live on. No, that doesn't work that way. We're just very passionate about what we do. But we've got a real problem here, and we've got to get a handle on it. We've got a window of opportunity, but we have to hit on it now. Thank you.
So what I would like to tell everybody is that we have all of the technology we need today to solve our climate crisis. We have spent a lot of time talking about the crisis and scaring ourselves, and there is a lot to worry about for sure, and we need to act quickly. But the transformation is happening. The clean technology is a better technology, and we should move to clean technology even if there were no climate change. It's the 21st century technology, and it's time to move past 20th century technology into the future. It will take, an all renewable future is possible. It will take all of our work and different efforts. It'll take activists and politicians to pass laws. It'll take citizens to act and purchase products, like move to an all-electric home and get heat pumps and solar panels and electric vehicles. It will take teachers, it will take community organizers, it'll take all of the work for all of us to do it. But this is an effort that we can do. We have done it in the past. It's actually not as big as a World War II effort. It is a lot of effort, but to win and to beat fascism in World War II took 40% of our gross domestic product. This will take much less, and we can do this. This is within our human ability to do. It's not that hard or that complicated. I'm not saying it's not hard, but it's something we can do. And it's an exciting future if we do move to that future, because it'll be cleaner, safer, and a better future.
Thank you. So building on that, what I'd like to say is that it is possible. The potential to go to 100% clean energy for 100% of the population on Earth has actually gone from sort of being impossible to inevitable. If you look at the pundits, It's just sort of a matter of when, not if, now. We all know that we have the technology, and that actually by adopting it at scale, we drive the efficiency and costs to benefit all of us going forward. So we really need to focus on making the inevitable now immediate and getting this all to happen sooner by getting behind this transition to clean energy as quickly as we can. And that requires all of us acting not only as consumers and producers and entrepreneurs involved in the industry and businesses that this opportunity offers, which is where I work, but also as activists and campaigners and voters and citizens, demanding of our so-called leaders and others that they do the right thing and set the policies and create the markets and the opportunities for this opportunity to flourish, because it will benefit us all. And I think once we pursue it as hard as we should, as was mentioned, it's not as big a lift as fighting fascism back in the day, but I feel that it's also an antidote to the kind of fascism that's rising in our societies now, that is coming out of the gross inequality of the failed paradigm of prosperity that was delivered by the fossil fuel industry and financialization of the 20th century. And with clean energy, we're offering to put power in the hands of people to distribute more these productive assets and the commanding heights of the economy going more to the community, which will in turn allow us to distribute wealth better, give more jobs. This is a much more job-dense, future employment-rich opportunity space, and engage people in the leadership and ownership of the productive businesses of the 21st century. And with that, we'll compete and combat with inequality and the rising difference between the rich and the poor, which is why we have demagogues rising and populism in all these places around the world. So it's sort of an antidote to the two great perils we face, climate change and a new kind of fascism, and we need to pursue it as hard and fast as we can. It's got to happen sooner than we currently are on track to do, but that's now the easier work than the initial lift, which was to get it to become possible from being impossible, and that's where we're at. We've just got to follow the course and make it go faster.
Well said, thank you. Is my microphone on? Can you hear me?
No, it's not
Do I have
on.
to switch it on?
Try again.
Can you hear me now? Oh, good. I'd like to...
Janet, you want to pass him your hand microphone?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh. Thank you, sorry. I'll never be a radio personality, will I? That's for sure. I'd like to thank everybody who put this great conference on, and I gather they do it every year. This is really, really a wonderful thing. That it's a wonderful thing that you're doing. And in general terms, a very big moment in my life was 10 years ago when a leading climate scientist made a statement based largely on the Arctic, that the world had reached a state of planetary emergency. And I was quite surprised that expert wasn't supported more by the scientific community, and it seemed immediately obvious to me that, oh yeah, we were. And I started looking into it, and I had been working on air pollution for many, many, many years, and had been working on global warming, so I started doing some websites, and I started what I call Climate Emergency Institute. So what I've been trying to explain to people is that we're in a terrible Earth emergency. I will call it an Earth emergency now, and we have to respond immediately. The scientists have been saying this for at least 10 years, that action has to be now. And tragically, because of the opposition from, very well put by the way, the opposition from not only the fossil fuel industry, but the investment banking corporations who are fracking the planet to death, hence my book, co-authored book. So they're either insane or they're evil, or they're probably both, and we got to beat these idiots.
Thanks. I guess what I would say is, first of all, everybody needs to understand that this is really an intergenerational issue. The climate system responds slowly to the forces that we apply to it. And as a result, we see climate changing now, but the potential for really disastrous impacts is what our children and grandchildren and their children will feel. And this is a strange situation because parents always sacrifice for their children. They don't mistreat them. But they don't really understand this. And it's hard to make people understand because of the difficulty in communication when there are very wealthy people who don't want the public to understand. And the tragic thing about this story is the fact that a solution doesn't really cost anything on the long run, because an economy is more efficient. If it's more efficient, it doesn't really cost you anything. And what we're doing now is subsidizing fossil fuels by not making them pay their cost to society. So it's a fairly straightforward solution. And you don't have to persuade people to make big sacrifices, just persuade them to understand it. The fact that we're going to have to add a fee, collect a fee from fossil fuel companies, and that fee is going to rise over time, and as it does, it will allow the alternative energies to take over. And if the money that is collected from the fossil fuel companies is distributed to the public, then the public will let this happen. Otherwise, they won't let it happen. That's the problem that we have. We have, on the one hand, we have a political party which says it's all a hoax. And on the other hand, we have a party that wants the money. And that's a problem, because the public will not allow a carbon tax if the money is going to the politicians. And it's a tragic situation that we can't get the centrist position to be understood. That's what we have to try to communicate. Thanks.
Hello. I'd say if there's one thing that's certain, it's that change is constant, and at this point in history, we're witnessing a telescoping of change. We're seeing the acceleration of history where 50 years of change are happening in a decade. The weight now of 7.5 billion people on this finite planet is causing stress to Earth's ecosystems. We're having deforestation, overplowing of fields, overgrazing of pastures, overfishing of our oceans, desertification, and of course climate change are the results. Now, when you put it all together, the picture looks fairly grim, and all these trends intersect at what sustains humanity, and that's really our food supply. Our ability to produce food relies on having a stable climate, because human civilization, it's evolved over the last 11,000 years or so, and climate was relatively stable, and now we're departing from that norm that humanity and the foods we rely on has ever known. And so it's clear that the world needs to make change. Business as usual is not working for us. We need changes, but the answers are out there, and the answers are relatively simple. We need to stop burning excess fossil fuels and upsetting the Earth's heat balance. We need to stabilize population, allow people to plan their family sizes by educating girls, allowing for literacy around the world. We need to take care of Earth's ecosystems because they really support us all. And it is possible if we all play a role and if we all get politically active and we let our leaders know that this is important because it's really the fate of civilization that's at stake. And I would say that the picture sounds grim, except you look around the world and you can see glimmers of hope, and what we need to do is tie them together and amplify them. So we can see South Korea reforesting its hillsides. We can see Iran making great headway in educating girls. And you can look at what the United States did after the Dust Bowl, how we were able to stabilize soils. We can figure out how to grow crops on smaller land areas so we don't have to cut down the Amazon rainforest to plant soybeans that then go to feed cattle that then are fed to the rest of humanity. We can all live on this planet if we all of us in the developed world, if we all start living a little lighter, but it doesn't require sacrifice. If you look at the renewable energy transition, which this book is about, we can see we're moving there, and it's taken a lot of political will, it's taken policy, but now markets are starting to drive the process. The costs of wind power or the cost of solar panel power in many parts of the world are now undercutting fossil fuels. So this change is starting to accelerate, and when you put it all together, we're really at the race between two tipping points. It's tipping points in our natural system and tipping points in our social and political system. Can we make the social changes and political changes we need fast enough to avert some of these major tipping points in nature? Can we avoid the Amazon forest from burning or the West Antarctic ice sheet from collapsing? I think so, but time is limited, and so we need to act fast, and we all need to play a role. Thank you.
I start from recognizing that I am completely part of this problem. I don't know how to live without electricity for a few days. I don't know how to live without a refrigerator for a few days, and I could go on and on. My angle has been looking at the internet's contribution to climate disruption, and forgive me, I'm going to read something. So, the internet is the largest thing that humanity has built. It thereby requires enormous amounts of electricity, water, conflict minerals. It generates enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. It is not possible to send a text message or an email, take a selfie, watch a video, participate in a video conference, including this one, buy anything online, store food in a smart, energy-saving, Internet of Things connected refrigerator, drive a zero-emissions electric or hybrid vehicle, do a GPS search, or even power a home with a renewable solar-powered system, PV system, or wind-powered energy system, without extracting from the earth hundreds of minerals, elements, and compounds, including coal, copper, quartz, coltan, cobalt, lithium, neodymium, oil, petroleum coke, typically from the tar sands, and fracked natural gas. Behind every flip phone, smartphone, tablet, smart appliance, and e-vehicle, there are hundreds of refineries, CO2-emitting coal-fired power plants, electric plants, nuclear power plants, chemical plants, steel mills, cement kilns, metal smelters, wood chips harvested typically from the Amazon, and factories of all kinds. To keep running, each energy-guzzling, toxic waste, and greenhouse gas-emitting operation depends on all the others. They interconnect by a network of electric substations, power lines, natural gas pipelines, container ships, trains, trucks, shipping lanes, railways, highways, telecommunications access networks, and data communication centers to form one gigantic global super factory. In other words, each and every manufactured item and online activity is the end product of all the industries and infrastructures in the entire world combined. Calculating the size of a household's carbon footprint is therefore, if you just add up your monthly bills, is therefore like estimating the mass of an elephant by weighing the tip of its tail. Those calculations do not include the power demands of infrastructure for cellular communications, internet services, or the electric grid itself. They show only a fraction of a household's total environmental impact. Becoming aware of these inconvenient truths is a very personal experience. Questioning our assumptions about the internet and renewable power and all kinds of energy use and decreasing our consumption requires collective action. And I would say for me, the most important thing is noticing that I cannot be part of this solution until and unless I am aware that I am part of the problem.
So I'm going to ask a question. Whoever wants to answer it can, if multiple people want, but you don't all have to answer this one. So in my mind, I've thought about this a bunch, and I think that the number one issue with climate change is that people somehow are not clear on timeframes. I saw a thing recently, I guess the IPCC released some report recently, and CNN had big headlines that due to climate change, the economy was going to shrink by 10% by 2100. And I was, laughing how ridiculous. Nobody could care less if in 81 years the economy shrinks by 10%. It's beyond farcical. No one cares. So the second anyone talks about climate change and then says, and if we don't do this by 2100, people are celebrating. Oh, they got 80 more years. When Guy McPherson says we're all going to be extinct in 7, then suddenly he's saying, what? What'd you say? So the question really that most people are saying is, I got a nice big TV, I got a heated and air-conditioned house, how long can I keep this going? So the real question is when? When do we get to the point that the storms and the lack of food and the disruptions are just so disruptive to a civilized society that people would care a lot? Are we a year away, 5 years away, 10 years away, 20, 40? How far away, and not about islands that are flooding far away. In New York, in Long Island, the people in this room in Long Island, how far away are we from real disruptions? And I don't mean just a few almonds not being on the shelf. How far away are we from real disruptions where the electricity might be out for 6 months, where we are really disrupted and they can't fill up the gas stations with gas anymore because the trucks can't get there and there's not food for everyone? When? What time frame in your mind, even though there's no real answer, how long do you think we have? When is the question?
I think it's the wrong question. You're going to have to wait a while, and by that time it's way too late. You can't wait until that occurs before we completely transform our energy system because of the lag in the system. We're already at a point which is extremely dangerous for young people and future generations. So we have all the knowledge that we need to know that this is a true story. It's not a hoax. I mean, there may be one person in Washington who thinks that, but we know that that's not true. And so I mean, we're not going to, I don't think we're going to wait until that happens. But, so if we can see things are beginning to happen now on the kind of things that you want to see, you know. But the real threat is just the fact that we're building into the climate system changes which cannot be prevented. You know, just to stabilize things at where they are now, you have to restore the planet's energy balance. The planet is substantially out of energy balance, and you've got to change the composition a lot. In fact, with some of the best scientists, relevant scientists in the world, we wrote a paper that said, oh, to rebalance, you got to go back to 350 parts per million. Well, that's pretty damn tough. IPCC is now talking about, oh, well, if we want to keep it 1.5 degrees, then we've got to start sucking CO2 out of the air at a phenomenal rate with no way that we can figure out how to do that in reality. So we're already at the point of extreme danger. We don't have to wait until you get those things that you're hoping for or thinking about.
And I think just to add to that, we are headed for a warmer world. You can't stop that. I mean, we're already in a warmer world. And there's heat in the pipeline, as Jim has written about in a number of papers, but the real challenge is getting a handle on the problem before it gets out of hand. We can live with some warming, but if we wait too long, then it gets out of hand, and then these cataclysmic events that you mentioned could well arise. But I have growing optimism because I think we're starting to turn the corner on this. It's in fits and starts, absolutely. Our current administration is not helping, but I am optimistic.
Yeah, a report crossed my desk maybe a dozen or so years ago about what climate change could mean for New York City. And they talked about the fact that storm surge is likely to increase and flooding will increase. You could envision New York City's subways flooding. And then Superstorm Sandy hit New York City, and everything that played out read very similar to that report that the scientists had put together and said these events are more likely to happen. So those of us in the field who are looking and saying, where is climate change going to hit first? 20 years ago, we would say, well, it's those low-lying small island states. They could be completely inundated with just a matter of feet of sea level rise. But then we had in the United States Hurricane Katrina, and we had over 100,000, 200,000 people having to evacuate, many of which never went back. And we never would have believed that the first large-scale flow of climate-related refugees would be in our country, our rich, developed country. Sure, we caused the problem, but it wasn't going to hit us. But it is, and I think it's each of these wake-up calls that's getting scientists saying, okay, it's becoming clear, these are the kind of events we're seeing, yet it's like when you get the wake-up call and you hit the snooze alarm and you kind of forget after the disaster, and politicians are very reluctant to say, well, now's not the time to talk about climate change. Let's get the infrastructure back. And but when will it be time to talk about climate change? So I think we don't have to wait 5 or 10 years. The science is in on what's likely to happen, when or where these events will happen. Nobody knows the order or the time frame, but I think we're seeing enough already that's disturbing and should make thoughtful people want to take action.
But just to clarify that question, I assume that we will change, but if we didn't, if we stayed on the exact course we are with a little bit of an increase in solar but nothing crazy, and if we just stayed on the course we are, continued to emitting, or even if we got better, if other countries started eating meat and polluting like crazy, what kind of time frames do you feel are we looking at? Are we saying that, are we talking about we have 5 years, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50? I assume we're going to make great decisions and turn this around, but if we didn't, what is in your mindset is the time frame before someone living in Long Island in New York, we had all these cataclysmic things to the point that normal life was completely not possible.
I can't, it's hard to pin a number on that because there's way too many unknowns out there, but if I were to throw a number out there for debate, I'd say 50 years. Just throwing out a number.
I'm still fixated on, I think you're asking a strange question, Steve, to be honest. Why wasn't Superstorm Sandy enough for New Yorkers? You didn't have months without power, but you had days and weeks in which Wall Street was flooded and the greatest city on earth was shut down and people died, and maybe it wasn't Huntington, Long Island, but it was the Rockaways that were underwater. And, we're a boiling frog as a species, unable to see the problem we've got. But I would argue your threshold was passed some time ago for many hundreds and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people. That we are killing millions annually. We are literally from climate-borne vector diseases, from extreme weather events. We're making morbidity rise. We're making refugees and internally displaced populations rise. Humanity's already crossed that threshold. I think maybe you're trying to ask about when does runaway greenhouse effect kick in and all of the positive feedback loops which Jim and others here have studied for decades. When do they become untenable or unable to be pulled back? Probably within 50 years. Again, it's sort of a mental attitude thing. Why are humans so stupid that we don't act in our own self-interest? And particularly this nation. I would argue most other nations on Earth where you do not have pretenders. Remember, we had all of the nations of significance on Earth sign the Paris Agreement just 4 years ago and say we need to do this. We had the G7 commit to get off fossils by 2070, I think, under Obama, the previous leader of this nation. We got one dude in the White House and now we're back to talking about whether it's real or not. Everyone else knows it's real and is trying to get off. The Chinese, the Indians, the big population nations, are they doing enough? No, but are they at least turned the corner and decided to do it? Yes, they are, because they're rational and they know their self-interest. The United States has a unique ability, I feel, to work against its own self-interest, and by which I mean the economic self-interest. We pioneered all the technologies we sit here on this table talking about. Photovoltaics invented down the road in New Jersey, lithium-ion batteries in Austin, Texas, you name it. We champion the change and then we let it go and become the boon of some other culture and economy. That's our choice. But, New York's already crossed that threshold a decade ago.
Well, I'd like to repeat we're in an Earth emergency. It's a climate system emergency. We are in the sixth mass extinction. Richard Leakey wrote the classical book 10 years ago. The experts at Stanford published 2-3 years ago that we were in the sixth mass extinction and we've been in it for a long time. And the title of the paper, the title of the peer-reviewed paper was Biological Annihilation Due to Loss of Vertebrate Species. There was a paper published just a year ago that used the same term, annihilation. And these are extraordinary things to read and words for scientists to publish. So I agree with the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who made several very powerful statements last year. And he made them in the hope and the expectation that the United Nations Climate Conference, which occurred in Poland last month, would really come up with some real progress, and that nations would firmly agree and firmly commit to put global emissions into decline, because global emissions are still increasing. Last year, emissions of carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels increased by a whopping 2.7%. And we can't assume that we have a future. 10 years, 20 years, it's all meaningless. We can't assume we have a future now. And to go back to the Secretary General, he said that climate change, he said, I have lots of big problems come through my desk, but there's one that's way bigger than all of them put together, and that's climate change. And he said climate change is, and obviously he was advised by experts, he said that climate change is quite simply an existential threat to most life on the planet, and particularly to humanity. That's no small statement. That is a momentous statement for a world leader to make. Unfortunately, it wasn't picked up by the media, but his later statements that he made this one in May, his other statements from the United Nations that he made in September of last year, they were picked up. And quite correctly, he said that according to the science, we have until 2020 to put our emissions into reverse. Putting emissions into reverse, by the way, was a phrase which was used by the IPCC assessment in 2007, over 10 years ago. And we're still increasing. Fossil fuel emissions are still increasing. The Secretary General said that if we don't put emissions into decline rapidly, like now, then he said, and again he was clearly advised by the experts, that we risk missing the ultimate boat, that we risk missing the time when we can prevent runaway climate change. Now, runaway climate change is a lay term, it's not actually a scientific term, but what it means, and Dr. Hansen has been talking about this for years and years and years, is that there is a massive amount of inertia in the climate system. And there's more than a massive amount of inertia in the climate system now, because as everybody understands, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is what matters. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is supposed to be at 350 parts per million or below, so that we have energy balance in the biosphere. It's now over 410 parts per million. It's rocketing up. It is increasing atmospheric CO2, which causes most of the ocean heating, most of the surface warming, and all of the ocean acidification. It's increasing, according to the World Meteorological Office, at a rate which is 100 times faster than natural CO2 increase, which gets us out of an ice age and into a warm period. And it's worse than that, because the WMO stated that according to all the science that we have, all the proxies that we have that go back 50 million years now, that atmospheric carbon dioxide has never increased this fast. All of humanity and all of life are in one hell of a fix. And as we've heard, it's not difficult to put it right. Our politicians, our leaders, are giving our tax money to fossil fuel corporations to burn up our future. They're actually burning up our food, because we have to have a stable climate, obviously, to have agriculture working for us. So I don't believe we've any time left at all. I believe we had no time left years ago.
I want to read you an article. This is from The Independent by Martin Hickman in 2009. And I want to know what you think of this. It says, study claims meat creates half of all greenhouse gases. Livestock causes far more climate change than first thought, says a new report. Climate change emissions from meat production are far higher than currently estimated, according to a controversial new study that will fuel debate on whether people should eat fewer animal products to help the environment. In a paper published by a respected U.S. think tank, the World Watch Institute, 2 World Bank environmental advisors claim that instead of 18% of global emissions being caused by meat, the true figure is 51%. They claim that United Nations figures have severely underestimated the greenhouse gases caused by tens of billions of cattle, sheep, pig, poultry, and other animals in 3 main areas: methane, land use, and respiration. Their findings, which are likely to prompt fierce debates among academics, come amid increasing from climate change experts' calls for people to eat less meat. In the 19-page report, Robert Goodland, a former lead environmental advisor to the World Bank, and Jeff Anhang, a current advisor, suggested that domesticated animals cause 32 billion tons of carbon dioxide, equivalent to more than the combined impact of industry and energy. The accepted figure is 18%, taken from landmark UN report in 2006. Livestock's long shadow. If this argument is right, Goodland and Ahang, it implies that replacing livestock products with better alternatives would be the best strategy for reversing climate change. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I can sort of support that statement, and I can give you some data. One of the really useful, interesting things that came out in the IPCC's fifth assessment in 2014 was they did something that they'd never done before. They worked out the temperature increase effect of sources of emissions. Before, they'd just taken emissions and they said it had this particular radiative forcing. And they worked it out over a 20-year period. And it was very revealing, because if you put their agriculture and what they called animal husbandry, which I will call killing animals and eating them, if you put those together, right, the temperature effect over this period was more than all industry. That's huge. It was actually more than half of all energy production. So it's a massive amount of global warming and climate disruption. It's massive, right? And we can't restore our energy balance, as Dr. Hansen has been telling us for years, unless we deal with all of the sources of the greenhouse gas emissions, right? So we have to make a complete switch off all fossil fuels onto clean, renewable energy, but we have to eat differently as well.
Indeed, we have not focused on our agricultural practices. Actually, when we think of reducing emissions, we have been focusing, or the media has been focusing mostly on electricity generation, on solar and wind technology. But just like it was just said, we need to focus on everything that is causing greenhouse gas emissions, and that includes agriculture. In some sense, it's not about which one creates the most. It's about reducing all of them to zero. We need to stabilize the climate, and we need to get our climate in balance, and that means getting emissions to zero, and reforestation as well, and other things that can help stabilize this. So we need to think of the electricity, we need to think of heating and cooling, of transportation, of our industrial uses, and our agriculture as well. We have to look at all of it. When Dave and I wrote our book, we focused on the energy infrastructure because that's what we had worked at, but that doesn't mean that the agricultural infrastructure isn't equally important, and books on that need to be written as well, so that we can tackle all of the different sectors that are producing this.
We also have to remember that the issues go beyond greenhouse gases. For example, if you want to raise cattle, what do you have to do? You have to raise feed corn. What do you do when you do that? Massive amounts of nitrogen fertilizer. Most of that ends up in the waterways, dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. So in other words, it goes beyond just the issue of climate change per se.
If I could add to that, I would, a number of years back, when trying to tackle the question of how many people can the Earth support, we ran some very simple calculations and looked at current global food production. And you know that if you're eating high on the food chain, eating a lot of milk, meat, eggs, products from livestock, you're consuming a lot more grain indirectly that's fed to animals, grain and soybeans. So if all of the world were to eat as much meat and therefore as much grain as Americans eat, the world could sustain about 2 billion people. Well, whoops, that ship has sailed. We're at 7.5 billion people. So what about the other end of the spectrum? What if we all ate like people in India, where vegetarian diets are much more common, though becoming less so? Well, at that level of world food production, we could sustain about 10 billion people at that level of consumption. But that might not be comfortable for many people around the world, and there are parts of the world where it does make sense to eat livestock, and livestock can be produced in various ways. So what if we tried somewhere in the middle, maybe the typical Mediterranean diet, where mostly plant-based, but you add in some meat here or there? Well, current Mediterranean diet could sustain about 6 billion people. So we need to go, all of us, a little bit below that. Maybe we could eat a little bit more livestock products than Indians, but maybe not quite as much as the Italians, and certainly not as much as the Americans. But if you want a good news part of the story, the United States is past peak meat. Meat consumption is actually going down in this country, which is surprising to many people. It has been for the last handful of years, and there's a number of reasons for that. Meat is expensive. Meat, especially during the recession, meat consumption went down, but it's continuing. So while eating lower on the food chain won't solve the climate crisis by itself, it is a way for people to get involved and people to make a change in habits, and we can find, perhaps we can meet somewhere in the middle and help the climate and help restore damaged ecosystems as well.
Can I give some statistics about internet consumption? So the entire internet traffic from year 2000, that's 365 days of internet traffic, is equal to 1 hour of internet traffic from the year 2015. The volume of internet traffic, of internet data, doubles every 2 years. According to a 2016 study from the semiconductor industry, by 2040, we will not have enough electricity to power computers. And whenever I say the word electricity, just think of greenhouse gas emissions. Smartphones' CO2 emissions will grow from 4% of total global emissions in 2010 to 11% by next year, 2020. This translates to a jump from 17 to 125 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year. That's a 730% growth. We are not looking at this. I could give more, but we need to include our internet consumption in our lifestyle question.
So if the President of the United States called you in and said, I want you to be my advisor and tell me, let's call it the top 5 steps that he was willing to do, instead of not a general theoretical answer, but what are the exact 5 things, 10 is even better, in order of priority, that you would, policies that you would make if you wanted to solve the climate change problem, and you had total control, you had total authority, everyone would listen to you, there was money to back it. What is the exact solution, exact plan of the things you would do? So, what are the exact things number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that you would enact, assuming that everyone would follow you? If we were desperate for a solution and we were willing to listen and willing to spend the money, what is the answer? What is the solution? As specific as you can, name the recipe. Step 1, the first 5 things that each of you would do to solve the climate change problem.
The first thing I would do is get a group of scientists together so that we could discuss the issue and come to agreement on this, because I don't think any of us individually will be able to make such a list that there would be an agreement on. But if it was me, I'd go with Jim's idea. Carbon tax, right at the port of entry.
Carbon fee.
A fee, thank you.
it has to underlie the whole thing, because the things you would do will work better once you make prices honest. And you're not going to phase out fossil fuels while you're subsidizing them. And we subsidize them indirectly as well as directly. So it seems to me that that first item on the list is so predominant that I wouldn't extend it to 10 things, although you can certainly think of the 10 things.
I can think of some things. So wireless internet access uses at least 10 times as much electricity as wired. So that means recognize that your mobile device is a luxury portal to the internet. We're going to have to reduce mobile access and get wired internet access. And then right now, about 3 billion people are not yet online. To give them online access, which would, universal access, which would be fair, so that they have educational and economic opportunities and family connections like those of us here, that will exponentially increase their consumption of electricity and their greenhouse gas emissions, their conflict mineral and other natural resources. So in order to balance that out, that means those of us will have to reduce our media consumption by 70 or 80% so that they can do that, they can have a little bit of access. So I think we're going to have to go back to kindergarten to learn how to share and and resolve conflicts. And just break down exactly how much energy is behind every screen.
A corollary on that, as an educator myself, somewhere on this list has to be science education. We're in an appalling situation in this country where we are not investing in basic science education of our kids. Apparently, from what I can gather, you can get all the way through high school without basically taking any kind of mathematics, for example. It's appalling. We have to educate our people if we're going to beat this. And I see this as a real problem.
I would say if I could advise the president on anything, I would say we are in a civilized society that's governed by the rule of law, and that we should pass laws to phase out fossil fuels by 6% per year. And that passing laws is not socialism, it is what a civilized society does. So I would say we need to look at our electricity infrastructure and then phase out fossil fuels by 3% a year and put renewables in to replace that, and clean technology to replace that, energy storage and so on. I would look at our transportation sector. You'd have to look at trains, electrified trains. You'd have to look at your airplanes. Air travel has a lot of pollution. Have a plan to move to perhaps hydrogen-powered airplanes. There are some electric airplanes as well that are being developed. Then you would also do your shipping and your big trucks and your cars. Then you would have to think of your heating, your cooling, your cooking, and your industrial practices. Then you would need experts on agriculture as well and talk about how to reduce the emissions and pollution from the agricultural industry as well and have a plan to remove that. Indications are we're about to blow our greenhouse gas budget. We are already at a dangerous level right now anyway. We're seeing the effects of climate change. We've already warmed the planet. Ideally, we'd have no more emissions. So we have to do it fast. If you could do it, if you really wanted to do it more, you could do it more than 6% a year if you want to be safe and ramp up our industrial infrastructure like you did for World War II. 40% of our GDP went to fighting fascism and beating Hitler and fascism in Asia as well. I mean, if you really, really wanted to do it, you would do indeed a World War II effort. We're not suggesting a World War II effort. We're talking about something that will take 4 to 6% of our GDP. 4% of our GDP is what we spend on defense, our defense budget right now. 4% is not something undoable. You know, it's something that we can handle. We're not going to have to turn our toy factories into factories, I mean, at 4 to 6% a year, into something, or, I mean, we have the factories. In fact, we have factories sitting in Detroit right now that are not being utilized. We have workers, we have people ready to work. So this is something we can do, and I would tell the president to invest in the country, and just like happened in the 1930s with the New Deal, we will stimulate the economy, we will have growth, we will have jobs, it will be cleaner, it'll be safer, it'll be cheaper, and that investment will come back to make a better society. It should also be a just transition as well, which is something that people say, but indeed, you want to make sure that folks who lose their jobs from the coal industry, from the fossil fuel industry, can be retrained, and that we have the opportunity to employ people and help this transition create stronger and healthier communities as well.
Could I comment on that? I think the idea that you're going to pass a law that says you're going to reduce emissions 6% a year, that's like prohibition. Or you're going to pass a law, you're going to outlaw adultery. You can pass a law, but it's not going to happen. If you want to affect it's not that simple. You don't just pass a law and that results in this. The public is not going to let the lights go out. Yeah, they will want the energy. So you need something that will actually work, and it's got to be economically sensible. 4%. Public is not going to accept suddenly a 4% reduction in the economy for some prescribed solution. You need to get the economy to help you with the solution, not try to fight it.
All right, here we go. With all due respect to Dr. Hansen, who's done yeoman's work for many years, I think that's naive about how political and social change happens, and what Leah was describing was what I would describe as simply a public investment strategy that will recoup its cost to the society in manyfold over years. And spending 4 to 6% of our national GDP, and the accounting of that as a fuzzy number, is something we choose to do as a society often, and many times much larger numbers, to achieve stimulus, to resurrect banks on Wall Street just a decade ago, to fight fascists 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, whenever it was. We do those things often. Currently, we do that annually to fight mythical wars that we don't need to be fighting. And that doesn't return in spades to our society. Instead, it brings us back the walking wounded and warriors that we're not taking care of. I think what we're talking about, and if Steve set up this hypothetical of a president that A, could do this, and B, would listen, which obviously we don't have, but perhaps if we did in the future have a president that had by fiat the ability to do this, I think it's pretty straightforward. And Jim, just to counter your argument there, you have the state of California, which is, if it were a country, the 5th largest economy on earth, having done exactly what you just said couldn't be done. Having a law and an executive order passed in the last year, which very clearly says we will be carbon neutral by 2045 and we will be 100% renewably powered by 2045. That is the law of the land of the 5th largest economy in the world. We're larger than Russia in California. We're larger than France and Great Britain post-Brexit. We are a very large economy, and there's no question, we will reduce the emissions down to 0, and we will ratchet up the clean energy quotient in the system up to 100 by law. And it's a path we've well trod. Over the last 2 decades, in fact the last 4 decades, we've decoupled our economic growth, which has continued in great numbers, from emissions. 17% rise in GDP in the state, greater emission reduction in the state, that's well known. It's very actually easy to do because what it does is actually create prosperity and wealth and jobs are what politics run on. So I would argue the list of things, if I may pile on to the actions that our president needs to take, are first set the goal and bring forward the sort of 2045 timeline to something which meets the science, which is more like 2025, 2030. So you mandate 100% renewable power systems and you electrify everything in those times, all the transport fleets that were mentioned, the trains, the trucks, the buses, the cars, and aviation and shipping, or you use hydrogen and other things from electricity. You mandate that. The second order of business is you create the training programs, from STEM education at school to vocational training at community colleges through career, master's degrees and all the rest of it at 4-year courses and so on. Because America doesn't currently train for that. We've done a lot of work around the battery industry, and we don't have the people that make batteries in America. The Gigafactory in Nevada has had Japanese workers on the factory floor. In Ohio, when they filled one of those Rust Belt factories with stimulus money to build A123 systems, they had to bring Koreans in to work on the machinery, because America doesn't train people to do advanced manufacturing of things like batteries anymore. So you have a massive educational program to match the ambition of the phase out of things, the sort of Rosie the Riveter vision that we've talked about with the war footing. And then you follow on with a suite of other job creation strategies, because by building jobs and wealth back into the society and investing in the creation of those things and the holding of that opportunity by Americans, for Americans, of Americans, you will get the political will to continue the course whenever it gets hard. That buy-in will be very important. So I would suggest you do things like reforestation programs in lieu of pastoral and grazing lands. You do great ocean farming efforts on the north coasts of New England. You re-kelp San Diego harbor. You re-wild places that can become carbon sinks, and you do job creation in a Green New Deal kind of model that also pays back with soil carbon and other economic benefits. And then you send signals through the market with policies like a carbon fee, and I agree that that is an important signal, but I don't think it's the first political act. I think it's the last one. The first is the job creation. We know, the presidential candidates, the people that do politics and not science, know that the thing that creates political will and support in the community are jobs and economic opportunity. And the labor statistics show that wind technicians and solar installers are the fastest growing careers in America this half of the century. So we pour support into those. We reverse the subsidies from fossil fuels, we put it onto the clean energy side of the ledger, and we carry on the course. And then we do some other financial tinkering. I would reenact the Glass-Steagall Act. I think that's an important climate policy. I don't want to go into the details as to why, but it is, just like a carbon fee is. There's a bunch of other stuff you do, but you also need to do the flagship things that motivate the community, that galvanize us to the cause and get us to realize the nation's interest, our security, our future prosperity are in this transition, aside from slowing down our contribution to climate change.
Danny. Oh, wait.
I'd like to, I actually do not object to saying you need to reduce at such and such a % a year, but don't tell the system how to do it. And your suggestion that, oh, let's tell them right off the bat, you invest first in solar panels, it's already been proven, that that's a useful thing to do, but it doesn't put us on this path at all. And on the contrary, the Citizens Climate Lobby, the group which is now 100,000 strong, which supports a carbon fee, has supported a study, economic studies, which show that if you put a rising carbon fee at $10 a ton, going up $10 a ton a year, after 10 years, it reduces U.S. emissions 30%. It has a huge impact. while so far the specified directions to build solar panels or build windmills have actually not reduced emissions, and the studies show that. They've had very little impact on emissions. If you really want the system to work for you, then you have to incentivize it to do that, rather than you or a politician deciding, oh, this is the technology which has to be used. We have a lot of, I disagree that Korea or somebody else has to supply the brain power. I think the brain power is in this country, and we just have to incentivize it. We have the best innovative capabilities. We still have the best universities. We can do this, but we have to provide the framework such that we're bringing that brain power into play in the most effective way. So to say that you're going to do carbon-free last, that's crazy. The economic studies show that's what you should do first, and it's the most efficient thing.
I guess I would say that I would agree that a carbon fee should happen sooner than later, because it helps make pricing more accurate. It more reflects reality, and it sends a powerful signal throughout the economy. And logistically, it's relatively simple. I think one of the good news about the climate problem is that it's a relatively small handful of corporations and actors, and looking globally, a relatively small number of countries, 20-some countries, create most of the problem. And so while it's hard to get 196 countries to agree to something, maybe you can get 20 countries to agree to something, or in the context of the United States, starting a carbon tax of $10 a ton is nothing. We would hardly even see it. It needs to ratchet up. It needs to be predictable. But when you talk to business leaders want predictability. They want to know what their costs are going to be in the future. And if you drill down on those business leaders, almost all of them have a shadow carbon price that they are using in their forecast, because they know it's coming, they know it's real. So I think it can be a combination of a carbon fee, perhaps a revenue neutral carbon fee, or a hybrid where some of the money is given back to the people, some of it can go to renewable infrastructure, smart city development so we can reduce our energy demand and create more livable places. There's no question that the science, funding for true science needs to be increased. Funding for education starting from below is wonderful, and it needs to be done, but it won't happen fast enough. So the job training right now is very important. If the president could, go and change Supreme Court decisions, I think they need to revisit the Citizens United decision that have given corporations far more power in the political system than ever before. And you talk to lawmakers and they say, why aren't we moving on climate change? Look back at Citizens United, because when you get so much money into the system from fossil fuel interests to preserve the status quo, you're not going to be making any headway. And then there's other things that can come from the executive branch, certainly setting standards for everything from appliances to the vehicles, and have them predictably improve. And I guess the bottom line is we need a government that is very forward-thinking, future-thinking. And parts of the government get it. I mean, the military, you look at the military reports, they're worried about climate change. They know what it's going to do to their assets. They're also worried about our uneducated population because they need to fill roles too. So I think just a general sense of future orientation would be incredibly powerful in the government.
I don't see solar PV systems or wind-powered system as carbon neutral. I've learned in the last few months about the process of manufacturing silicon wafers for electronics and for solar panels. So under the glass covering of every solar panel, there are about 100 squares of silicon wafers. And those are broken up for everyone's electronic device as well. And I should say, starting in 2013, we manufactured more transistors than farmers grow grains of wheat or rice. So we're already in a major shift that we're not even aware of. But let me describe briefly what goes into manufacturing silicon wafers for electronics and for solar panels. You start by mining pure quartz gravel, then you need a hard wood with some moisture in it. Typically this comes from the Amazon. Then you need a pure carbon. Typically this will come from a place called tar sands. You transport those three items to a smelter, which is kept at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit at least 330 days per year. That takes an enormous amount of energy. Right now, it's usually powered by a coal-fired power plant, and a nuclear power plant. There can be some geothermal involved, but it's a really energy-intensive greenhouse gas-emitting process. Out of that first step, you get metallurgical-grade silicon, which is about 98% pure. That is not pure enough for electronics or for solar panels. So you take the metallurgical-grade silicon, and that gets shipped to a bell jar furnace that's kept at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit most of the year. If you interrupt this process, you could blow up the facility and you'll certainly lose the silicon, and no one's going to want that. That's, again, a really energy-intensive process, and I haven't gotten started. There's more involved. In the process of manufacturing these things, I could read to you what New York State's Department of Environment allows from one smelter, the emissions that it allows. We're talking CO2, formaldehyde, HCl, lead, oxides of nitrogen, particulates, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, sulfur dioxide, and sulfuric acid mist. These are things that are allowable from one smelter in New York State into your airways per year. We're talking, in terms of particulates, up to 75,000 tons per year. I could show you all the others. But anyway, it's not a carbon neutral process to manufacture the silicon wafers necessary for solar panels or for our electronics. So we need to recognize that these are hazardous processes, that they are greenhouse gas emitting, and we need to be able to talk about it. And I will just say, Danny and I talked earlier, and I am one very appreciative fan that he said to me, yes, we need to recognize what has been reported to me in the last few months.
I do want to say one thing. If we're talking realistically what we should do today, and in our current climate, a carbon fee is indeed a good thing to do. We are a society right now that seems to want the market to make decisions for us, for sure. And indeed, what is being done in California, where there's a law passed to move to 100% clean energy, and sorry?
And a cap and trade.
And a cap and trade system is ideal. What I'm concerned with, if we only rely on a carbon fee, is whether we can make this transition fast enough. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, because we should do everything that we can to move to clean technology. The other thing is, if we do pass laws to phase out fossil fuels, the laws should also include putting energy back into place, generation back into place, so that we still have enough energy. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say clean energy and then let the market decide what clean energy the utilities and whoever wants to implement. Because indeed, this technology is moving forward, and the technology that we are using today to create clean energy is not what we're going to use in the year 2030 or the year 2050. In 1985, we had personal computers and we were typing in DOS, programs, in 1990 as well. And today we have smartphones. So saying we shouldn't start today is like saying we shouldn't have used our personal computer in 1985 because we didn't have the smartphone yet. So I think it makes sense to start implementing the technology we have now. Research and development will go into it. Indeed, let the market decide what clean technologies we want to use, and then let progress and innovation and entrepreneurship begin and grow in our country, and it would be great. So I think we need all of the tools. The idea of passing sweeping laws right now is just, how do we solve the problem if we had, our wish come true?
I just want to say two things to a couple of the last passages here. One is just about California. We have effectively had a price on carbon of a kind through a cap and trade scheme, which is very controversial and is mixed at best. And I think, if you were to look at its effect across the economy, it's been minimal on emissions at best, and there are some arguments and studies that suggest it's shifted them around and imposed a burden on minorities and others that have historically faced other injustices, and the best outcome they can find is that it's raised a lot of revenue, billions of dollars, which is now being invested by the state in things like the R&D that Leah rightly points out is what's really, I think, going to unlock all sorts of new opportunities for us, and that's where I live, trying to harness market forces to get entrepreneurs and startups starting up to bring these solutions to the market. But the real lived experience is that market signals alone are not enough, actually, and mandates do work. As I said, we have successfully reduced emissions in California while growing a pretty powerful economy, and some of the biggest household names in the world, like, internet companies, admittedly, but you're all holding them in your hands and pockets and stuff and using them daily. So we've done well while reducing emissions because of renewable portfolio standards and mandates, and the California Air Resources Board that have administered the cap and trade system are now resorting to telling bus fleets, you've got to reduce by a percentage annually, and by a certain date certain, you have to have gone to 100% electric vehicles, because we know those policies work. And so I think we've got to be honest about what politics are going on and what works in our society, and the fact of the matter is it's a mix of instruments, no one silver bullet, silver buckshot surely, but it's both and we need an entrepreneurial state that can support it. To Katie's point, I want to acknowledge absolutely what she said at the end there, which is that we need to dig into these numbers and what she's learned about silicon production, some of which I knew, some of which I think is news to me. I just want to raise the question of carbon neutrality in a technology. I accept the argument that the production of the solar panel at the time of production is not a carbon neutral thing. Obviously, there's a carbon footprint to it. I think what must be true is if the thing produces electricity over time, which displaces dirty electricity, then it is sucking effectively carbon out of the system or not producing carbon dioxide. And what we've looked at in studies I've seen around this topic is that yes, it is an energy intensive process, and yes, much of it is coal-fired right now, but it could be fed by solar and renewables. But the energy input is returned on that energy investment in a matter of years, and thereafter it is a net neutral or negative carbon product. And currently we warrant or guarantee solar panels for 25 years of productive life, so if it takes 3 years to pay back the energy required, they will work for another 21 years, which is a 7-fold return in carbon emission reduction by not using fossils to produce electricity. And I think we've got to give some credit to that. I'm not trying to be tricky. I'm just trying to say, yes, as a product sitting idle or inert, it's not carbon neutral. But then in its productive life, it goes out and it acts like a big hoovering machine, reducing carbon emissions from the economy. And that's why we actually do need to spread solar. And I want us to be careful about raising these questions. They're legitimate questions. We have to solve for them. That's another entrepreneurial opportunity. But we should not obfuscate the solutions we have at hand, to Leah's point also, that we have to pick up the tools we've got today to fix the problem, which is already past midnight, which is that we've got climate change on the horizon, and anything that's not sticking carbon in the sky, we should be using.
Can I still have something else. And I cannot say enough how much I appreciate Danny's response, because this is really what we need. We need to be able to bring new information and shred everything, and that's scientific method, where we're looking at all the available information. One of my concerns is that when people do have a solar PV system, then they can think, okay, I can get a really big plasma TV, I can get a jacuzzi sauna, I can get a new blender, a new toaster, a new blah, blah, blah. And we absolutely need to recognize that we've got to limit our consumption. We must prioritize what we consume. Just because you have a solar PV system or whatever, it doesn't take you off any hook. I should say that in first person. It doesn't take me off of any hook from trying to reduce my consumption.
Amen.
So I just want to mention that, in a way, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their excellent 1.5 degrees C report, sort of gave the answer, which was that we had to bring about profound change in all sections of our society. So everything has to change, basically. We've got to learn that we've been doing it all wrong. And I totally agree with the fee-bait. Governments agreed to do that, though, back in the Earth Summit in 1992, and they re-agreed in 2012. It's full cost accounting and prohibiting externalization of costs that kill people and destroy the planet and wreck the future. So we have to actually, I believe we have to pass laws to prohibit that kind of activity. The only way to pass laws, of course, is that people have to demand them, right? So people have to be encouraged to, the grassroots groups. There's a really good group in the United States called the Climate Mobilization. They're doing a city-by-city emergency project. They're having success. Another activity which is legalistic, which I know Dr. Hansen has been supporting very well, is our Children's Trust. That really could be and should be groundbreaking, because that's based on the law of the public trust doctrine. So it would be crucial, and that's encouraged other countries and other states to do the same thing. But we do really have to have that public trust doctrine established in the law of the land, which means that it's not legal to deprive future generations of a decent planet, let alone to deprive them of a habitable planet to inherit. So we do have to have those laws. We have to start, I think the section of society to start with is obviously the economics. We have this perverse, terrible, environmentally destroying form of economics, and we're going to have laws to change that, right? It has to be made illegal, as I say, to call externalizing costs something that corporations can get away with. So we have to have laws to regulate the corporations. I think we've been learning that for many, many, many years. And the corporations obviously have got way, way, way too powerful. The public can't have the corporations running everything. So the investment banks are basically running everything. I think everybody sort of knows that, right? They have to be regulated. They've been very successful in deregulating themselves. So they have to come under regulation. Do I hear something?
Next door. That's next door.
Oh, that's next door. They're getting excited next door. Okay.
Yeah, could I correct one thing I said before? Impression I left. I'm not saying that we don't need laws. In fact, just to be a little more optimistic about regulations, EPA has been pretty effective.
Yeah, you're right.
Look at something like refrigerators, where a builder would prefer to just build the cheapest refrigerator and sell the house cheapest, but over just a few years you can recoup the cost of a very efficient refrigerator. And so we should have laws that say you can't build that crummy one. You've got to use an efficient one. And we do have such law, and we've done extremely well. And California has actually led the world in those developments. And the other example, well, yeah, there are many cases where you need laws, like electronics should not be drawing power when they're not being used. You should it makes it a little more expensive to build it that way, but you can do that. But we should not confuse, on another point, cap and trade with carbon fee, because cap and trade, so many hooks and eyes that it turns out to be not very effective. And I tried to persuade Jerry Brown of that, but he wanted the money. They like to get the revenue to use for their favorite thing, and so there are various reasons why politicians like to go that route, but it's not the best route for the public, and it's not the best route to get rapid reduction.
I just want to say that the first thing that should happen, and unfortunately it's not going to happen because we have terrible, corrupt politicians, obviously, the IMF says that the subsidies that our governments on our behalf, they're sort of stealing our money and giving it to the fossil fuel corporations. The IMF says it amounts to trillions of dollars. Even on direct subsidies, I think the latest from the IMF is $600 billion a year. So obviously that has to stop, but governments aren't going to stop doing it. The first report on subsidies that came to the conclusion that they're not justifiable economically, ecologically, or socially, you're going to find it's hard to believe, but it was from a World Bank report in 1990. And ever since, all the intergovernmental organizations, including the International Energy Agency, that's been very good on pushing for stopping these subsidies. They call them inefficient subsidies. And the OECD, the World Bank, as I mentioned, the IMF, of course, I've mentioned, they've all been saying that these subsidies are damaging, they make no sense at all, and they have to stop. So the public really has to push their governments. There's just no other way. They've got to rise up and say, you got to stop, using our money to trash our planet. And I do hope that our Children's Trust is going to be successful. I'll have to ask Dr. Hansen, if you've got any information. The present government, of course, is playing fast and loose with them. So, but the kids have these rights. They have a right to a decent planet. And we got to pass laws if that's what it takes.
So assume that you were in a time machine and you went 15 years into the future, and the parts per million, the carbon parts per million, instead of being 410, it was 710. And assume that the flood waters had risen, and now you were the president. So assume it's 15 years in the future, everything's way accelerated dramatically. You are the president, you have full control, you can take any actions. What are the exact things that we would do that would have the most, forgetting about what you think, what would work? If we got into a situation where we understood we were in the worst of the worst shapes, what would actually work? If everyone would cooperate, if we would, what could we do if everyone was willing to do anything? What would you do? Is there a giant sucking machine we could build? Is there something like what would you do? You'd take, number one, you'd say no one's allowed to eat meat ever again. You take that off, if that was causing a problem.
The first thing is the public have to be told the truth. They have to be told the terrible truth. I forgot to mention that atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is the highest in 3 to 5 million years. Our species has only been around a couple of 100,000 years. Atmospheric methane goes back to the cattle meat thing, but it's not only that. Wetland rice paddies is a big source of methane, and unfortunately we got global warming, so that's increasing the methane. Methane level right now, I got the latest figures because apparently the government has gone back to work, so NOAA is being allowed to publish the figures again. So that's why I know that CO2 is the seasonally adjusted mean CO2 is over 410. It's 412 now. Atmospheric methane is 1,870. Now, to put that into some context, and the public has to be told these truths, and the public also has to have it explained to them. And it's the job of government to do that. Unfortunately, we have a government that's doing exactly the opposite. So CO2, it's past 800,000 year ice core limit, 300. It's now at 412. So the public has to get this, right? They have to be told this over and over and over. Methane's concentration over 800,000 years, the maximum was 800, right? We're now at well over 2.5 times. So they have to be told the effect that this is going to have. And they have to be told there is no time left. It's very clear from the last assessment from the IPCC. The IPCC gave us numbers as well, and that was a very good thing that they did, right? The media picked it up. And what it means is that by 2030, right, CO2 emissions have to be cut in half. 45%, 2010 have to be cut in half. That has to happen. And the other interesting thing that wasn't picked up that I can share with you is that the IPCC worked out the amount of reduction of each particular fossil fuel by 2050 so that we could keep the global surface temperature hopefully below 1.5 degrees C by 2100, but the way they put it was it'll overshoot a bit and maybe then we can bring it down. But they said that we had to, fossil fuel emissions had to be, fossil fuel energy on average had to be reduced 86% by 2050. So the numbers, I think, have to be gotten out there as well. And that, because it's scientific proof, I agree with your point about the state of the science, but fossil fuel age has to be ended, and soon.
Right.
Well, you were saying we got to 700 parts per million or something like that, which wouldn't happen in 15 years, but if we got that far, we're in deep doo-doo at that point. And at that point, do you say, okay, geoengineering? Now, I cringe at that because of the law of unintended consequences, but if you're at 700 parts per million, maybe this is the time where you say, okay, I'm going to send a fleet of airplanes out there and I'm going to seed the stratosphere with lots of sulfate aerosols to simulate a whole bunch of volcanic eruptions. Boy, I'd hate to do that because of the law of unintended consequences. I could imagine a world where CO2 levels are really high and there's so many aerosols in the atmosphere I can't see to the end of the room, okay? But if we got to 700 parts per million, where do you go? Drastic action at that point.
Yeah, you're right. And we need a global climate and oceans Manhattan project, right? So I think that's a great example. It's a bad example because the United States, they got all the best scientists together, right? And they put them in somewhere in the middle of the desert and said, you got to come up with a bomb, right? And they only had formulae to start with, you know. They had nothing, you know. It was a very nasty thing to do, but it was a brilliant achievement. It was absolutely amazing. Surely to God we can do that, you know, and put all the experts together in one place and say, we are going to pay you lots of money, you can have all the resources you want, okay, just come up with the cutting edge, the very best renewable energy and some safe, predictable method to get some CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's going to take that. Hopefully the military will push some sense into the present government. Sorry, I should have been looking at the audience. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my points across to you, not to the other panel members, but you really do deserve to know the truth and to know that there are solutions there, and the solutions have got to be made to happen like now.
So, with your question, Steve, I think you should probably have another author up here whose name I can't remember, but it's actually apparently a nom de plume. He wrote a book called Ultimatum, he or she, and I think he goes by the name Glass, but people think that it was one of the US negotiators under the Framework Convention. It's about the 2032 federal presidential election, and the big issue and the act of government that is enacted, to answer your question, about 15 years from now, 13, 14, whenever 2032 is a tax policy and an eminent domain policy to basically relocate much of the United States population, because by then the sea level rise is kicking in. Miami, Boston, New York, San Francisco Bay, parts of LA, they're all going under, and we basically have to build the new Manhattan in Kansas and the new Miami in Dakota and all the rest of it. And so the first act of the government of 2032 or 33, when that election will occur, is this relocation, the great relocation. But I'm not arguing that that's what the act should be. What I think it should be, to answer your question and to try to respond a little bit to my friend here, Peter, is not to drum the numbers more into the heads of our dumb children then and others, because it doesn't motivate them. I have teenagers. I tell them why failing exams is not good for their careers, and it's not as good as trying to open their eyes to motivation. You know, if you read The Little Prince, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, or whatever his name was, said something like, if you want to cross the ocean, don't organize the people and buy the lumber and divide the labor and start building ships. Teach them to yearn for the vast endless ocean. And we have to give people something that we're for, not something that we're against. We have to stop talking about this problem, depressing people with the science, killing people with the numbers, boring people with the facts. I hate to say it, but the communication we as a movement, and I'm taking responsibility for this because I've done this as a job since 1992. I was arrested in Rio at the Earth Summit. I was arrested at subsequent Earth Summits. I was arrested with Jim Hansen at the White House to stop the Keystone XL thing because they needed a business guy. I do business, I invest in this stuff. And yet the bulk of our communications for that 30-year career of mine has been, you all are doing the wrong thing, burning fossil fuels and being bad and killing your kids. But do you know what the human animal hears? Because of our biological wiring and our brain science, you all are doing. That's where it stops. Our ability to comprehend things is relatively limited as a species, and we reinforce the behavior every time we say it. If we were saying, you all are building the solution, you are all doing the right things by lightening your footprint, by lowering your meat consumption, by adopting those solutions, by buying solar, by voting for the Green New Deal, by doing these things, you might actually give this millennial generation some hope rather than despair, some opportunity rather than dismay, something to live for rather than just to go up and die for. I'm sorry, but I feel like we sound like a bunch of old people who have got to that stage in our lives where the young kids are all screwed and we've screwed the pooch ourselves and we're sort of owning it and we're not giving any future to anyone. And that is the greatest shame on us, because it is incumbent on us as people of privilege and power, which we have. We author books, we do lectures, we do this stuff to provide answers, not problems.
With respect for your superior criminal record to mine, we are fighting. Dr. Hansen's been fighting for years and years and years. We're working hard on behalf of today's children. That's what we're doing, right?
I respect that.
And hang on a minute. We are not telling anybody, particularly the young people, that this is their fault. It's the fault of how we're governed. It's the fault of our system. It's the fault of the economics. It's the fault of corruption. It's the fault of the corporate banking system and the whole debts. It's the fault of the huge amount of money which is absolutely being poured down the drain, wasted $1.6 trillion a year on armaments we're at again now. So no. I think we're all doing the right thing. I don't think we're doing the wrong thing by telling the public the truth and demanding that these changes are made and they happen quickly. I don't think we're instilling despair into people. I mean, if I thought that for a minute, I'd quit. And by the way, I'm a medically qualified doctor, so I've heard this argument, okay? I spent my life in medicine, right? People they're not like deer. People don't go into despair when they're told that they have a sort of overwhelming or life-threatening situation. That's not what human beings do. And our whole history is that we rise to challenges that seem to be overwhelming and impossible, and we overcome them, and we succeed and we prevail, and after 200,000 years, here we are, discussing about how to save the planet.
I hope you're right.
I will say, in a hopeful sense, I'm again speaking as an educator, what you see like at University of Colorado is environmental studies is this huge program now. Everyone wants to get into it. And this is students who are, 22, 21 years old, who have never known a time when there wasn't a climate change debate. And they're all into this. They're all very interested in this and increasingly aware of the issues, and they're coming in droves to be studying this thing. So there is hope.
In terms of the internet, if I'm looking 15 years ahead, I would want to say no to 5G, no to fifth generation of wireless infrastructure, no to the Internet of Things where we are flooded with machine-to-machine communications. And then how would I phrase that affirmatively? I would say, I have enough. We have enough. And I don't know how to teach that, but that's the concept.
Just one comment on that. I don't think we can tell India and some other parts of the world that you can't have more, because they're in pretty low status, and I hope that there are not going to be, that there is not, I think that there is potential in innovation to do things more energy efficiently. I'm wondering about your silicon, because are we going to be using silicon 20 years from now, or do we have some other ways of doing the numbers which is going to be a lot more energy efficient? What is it?
Graphene.
Pardon?
Graphene.
Well, yeah, or even other, what is it when you're doing the molecular, yeah, anyway, I think that it's not going to be more and more silicon, I hope. And that and that we will find ways, but we have to have the, I'm a broken record, but we got to have the incentives to find those ways. But I think we can do it. And I think young people need to be challenged to be doing that. But they do have to know what the situation is, too, so we have to be honest about that.
At the moment, as I understand, we're manufacturing 10 times as much silicon for solar panels than for electronics. Most of the production is happening in China, where there are essentially no regulations whatsoever in terms of the emissions, like the ones I read to you from New York State smelters. I also just read about a month ago that there are now some biodegradable transistors. I don't know what they're made from. I just know that they're being made, and I don't know. It's like you're going to be able to buy things for less than $10, and they'll biodegrade. But I am so suspicious because just this constant consumption of more and more things it's just a problem, even if it does biodegrade. But I don't understand it. It's more than I understand.
I'd like to say that the burning of coal has to be prohibited. You know, don't like to mention this, but I mean, all the wind turbines and everything, they're being made by burning coal. That's how they're being manufactured, right? And I hear it about, you know, India and China, and my God, I'm a Brit. You know, we haven't treated those countries particularly well. But the first people, and they're doing it already, the first people to suffer from climate change are the poorest people in the poorest countries, right? So we just can't continue burning coal. That's out. I mean, that is causing the deaths of millions of people a year from air pollution. When global warming gets worse, it's going to increase that air pollution. So we do need a ban on coal. We must prohibit the burning of coal. If that continues, there's no future, right?
So I wanted to comment on, I do believe it is time for solutions. And Dr. Hansen, Dr. Serreze, everybody here has done work on sounding the alarm and telling everybody, telling the world how much danger we're in. And that's really very important work that everybody has done. And I think that it's very much appreciated that this work has been done. But we have to work now on solutions. We've as was mentioned, we've been talking about this since 1992. Actually, before, my co-author wrote a book in 1972, and they already knew that burning carbon could cause global warming. And he talked about global warming in his book at that time, or perhaps he published it in 1973 or 4, I can't remember the exact date. So we've known it, but we have to, how do we motivate people now to make this energy transformation that we need? We have the fossil fuel industry that is entrenched, that is receiving subsidies. It's not like the last turn of the century when people were on horse and buggies and the Ford Model T came out from the assembly line and everybody jumped onto the Ford Model T, and we had a transformation in 13 years or less. We have a different market today. So in World War II, we decided to fight fascism. We were debating whether to be involved, and then we got bombed by Pearl Harbor. Not by Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor got bombed by the Japanese, and that motivated everybody to act. I think Steve has been talking about, well, how, in some sense, his questions to me are, how bad does it have to get before we're going to act? Hurricane Sandy didn't do it. The other hurricanes haven't done it. These forest fires in California, where we had horrible forest fires that are apocalyptic forest fires. British Columbia was burning. We had burning in Alaska. We were burning in Nordic countries in
Sweden.
Was it Sweden? Places you can't. I went up to try to get away from the fires in California to the San Juan Islands for the summer, and there was, we had bad air because of forests burning in British Columbia. Okay, so that's not enough. Apparently, that's not motivating us. Apparently, Wall Street being flooded isn't enough to get us acting. California is moving on this. That's awesome. New York has passed some laws in New Jersey for 100% electricity, Hawaii for 100% clean electricity. Actually, Hawaii is, I believe, 100% renewable. The other states are for clean electricity. But what do we need to do now? I don't think it was a discussion of that we haven't done the right thing. It's that now, it is like talking to teenagers. I have two teenagers, well, a teenager and a preteen now, which is kind of traumatic for me because talking to them is very hard, and getting them to listen, to put on their coat is hard. And so, that I think that's the question Steve's asking. I think that's the question that we're asking right now.
Well, let's assume that everyone is motivated. We've been very clear that you were saying that we need a carbon fee to recognize the true cost of what carbon is doing to the atmosphere. I'm saying, and I think you're somewhat agreeing, that eating animal products, stopping eating animal products is another thing that people can do that would contribute positively. Katie is saying that we should reduce consumption of everyone. You're all sort of saying to stop subsidies for fossil fuels. And I think we're saying you want to move towards renewable energy, on replacing the current sources of energy with renewable energy. So let's just try to, one more time, go through each of you and just kind of restate again, if you had motivation, if you had cooperation, if we had the money, if the president would listen to you, what are the three things? So we're saying a fossil fuel. You're saying absolutely there's got to be a carbon fee. And we're saying absolutely we should not eat animal products. Are we saying we should only eat organic because that would reduce chemicals? Like assuming we have the motivation, what are the action steps that you want us or the president to take? Try to be more direct, less theoretical. In other words, assume we're all bought in, everyone's bought in, people watch the video, and they just want to know what to do. So the first thing is everyone now knows to say to their politician, we need a carbon fee. They know they're supposed to eat less animal products. They know they're supposed to say no more subsidies for fossil fuels. What else clearly are you saying are the three things that you would like, three things that we should all make sure to do or tell our politician to solve this?
Embrace science education.
We should all be checking our bank accounts, no matter how wealthy or unwealthy we are, because we'd find out that a lot of our money is being used, right, to build more coal plants and more tar sands and more pipelines. And I can attest, admittedly I did it very slowly, but years ago I started transferring all my savings, investments from into renewable energy, right? So now all my money is in renewable energy. So I'm really invested, in seeing this thing work out. Well, my friends told me that I was most unwise years ago when I started doing this. Well, I've done just fine. I think individually, I really get the message on personal responsibility. I think that's really, really important. We are definitely all part of the problem, right? But individually, if we get our money out of fossil fuels and put our money into renewables, I think that would make a world of difference.
You're looking at me?
Anyone that would like to comment on what I had said?
I can say one of the worst things you can do is download a video wirelessly in terms of energy consumption. So again, recognize, I think smartphones showed up in 2007. Basically, that means everyone's got 24/7 mobile access to the internet, and our consumption has increased exponentially. I'm just talking about media consumption. And the more pixels something has, as in a video has more pixels than a photo, which has more data than a voice call or music, which has more data than a text message. As you increase the data that's transmitted, that requires more electricity, which is going to generate more CO2. So download videos only by a wired device, by a wired computer. I'm not saying to get rid of wireless devices. Of course, I would love it, but I don't think it's realistic to say it. But recognize that they are luxury items. Get your landline restored. You especially want that in the event of a power outage, because a wireless device is going to run out of power. There are lots of reasons to get a landline. And try to reduce your own media consumption by 3% per month, and just keep at it, 3% per month.
Yeah, I think you're right about the internet and the IT. I mean, what are we doing with it? You know, we're just playing, right? I mean, just playing games, right? Burning up energy, I think you're absolutely right. We really have to question the direction we're going with that. You know, everything we invent, our culture seems to have to use. You know, we don't seem to think about whether it's going to be good for the future or hurt the future, whether it's going to be good for the planet or hurt the planet. You know, we just seem to dive into it. And I think you're right, I'm with you. I don't think that's a great thing that we're doing at all.
I just want to get back to the education bit for a minute. We've got a big problem here in that there's just too much ignorance out there, too much of a lack of understanding of what the real science issues are. Oh, people say, oh, I read it on the internet, it must be right. No, it is not right. And it is up to the informed citizen to be able to separate out what is good information, true information, from what is nonsense. And that means you have to be educated at some level on the science. I'm not saying everyone's got to have a Ph.D., right? But you have to be educated in the basic science issues, because unless we understand the science issues collectively as a society, we are not going to be able to address them.
One other thing we haven't mentioned yet, which I think is foundational to the problem, and that's the campaign finance. You know, our democracy has been totally subverted by money. And that's kind of the root of this whole problem. If we didn't have that, if we had democracy working the way our founding fathers intended, then the fossil fuel industry would not be ruling us the way that it does. And we just, you know, there was some talk about this. John McCain at one point that was his big issue, but then he realized that he couldn't beat it and still get the nomination for presidency, so he gave up. And the whole country has kind of given up on it. It's a very fundamental problem, which I think we have to address.
I totally agree with you. You're absolutely right. It is fundamental to our destruction of the future and the planet. It's massive corruption is what it is, right? You know, on a massive scale. And so, yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. Oh my God.
I'm just going to sort of stick with my core area of knowledge and some level of expertise, I hope, which is to set some big, audacious goals that inspire people and motivate them around electrifying everything, powering it all with clean energy, and setting the building codes and the planning and zoning permissions to create livable, walkable cities and adopt better lifestyles and other things, and establish the incentives through carbon fees and other programs to allow those things to flourish and happen. Then unleash the genius of entrepreneurialism and an informed citizenry to go and make that magic happen and deliver on those visions and those goals. And you know, without sounding Pollyanna-ish about it, I think there's a lot of magic in that. And where it is not possible because of entrenched interests and incumbencies protecting their own vested interests, use politics and the force of people power to take them down, to reverse the subsidies, the perverse subsidies they receive, to undo their hold on the democracy in the streets and at the ballot box, with popular collective action driving the change.
Yeah.
Do we have the ability right now to quickly become 100% renewable energy within 20 years if we wanted, if we had cooperation?
5 if we wanted.
Yeah, the published literature is
Absolutely.
10 years.
And would that
We can do it in 10 years.
would that solve all of our energy problems if we had full cooperation and spent the money and became 100% renewable in 10 years? Would that solve everything?
To Katie's point, I think we need to constantly, you know, drive efficiency and, you know, the consumption question so that it doesn't just grow and grow and grow and grow. And, you know, I do believe in innovation. You have some solution to that problem, and we can use new materials and other technologies if we pursue that.
We also need to bring up the Jevons paradox. William Jevons was a British economist. In 1862, he wrote a book called The Coal Question, and he explained that energy efficiency is the cause of increased energy consumption. The reason is that as you manufacture goods by the millions, then you lower the cost, and that means more people can buy them. And that means you're going to be mining many, many more tons of coal to run the power plants. You're going to be mining many more natural resources to create the products. So energy efficiency causes increased energy consumption. It also leads to an increased population, and it does grow the economy. The other thing is that none of those prices reflect the true costs. They don't reflect the true environmental costs or the true social costs. So we need to include that paradox and true costs in our day-to-day lives, in our economic development.
I think there's one point there. Most of the things I would agree with, but it's not true that energy increases population. Those countries that became wealthy by means of the Industrial Revolution, they replaced human labor with fossil fuels, but they got wealthy, and then the women decided they didn't like to have 6 children, and so I think that the population, we are overrunning the planet, and that needs to be addressed. But I think it's best addressed actually by increasing the wealth, and we need energy to do that, but it needs to be clean energy. But I do think that overconsumption is a valid point, and so it may be that as fossil fuels are phased down, that the carbon fee needs to be replaced by an energy fee. They'll make it more precious rather than people just wasting energy.
We need to have a wealth tax, by the way, because, I'm trying to remember numbers, but it's like something like 10% of the world's population is responsible for 50% of the emissions, something like that. So as well as a carbon fee, we need a wealth fee, and we're all taxed, right? We know it. But that will require legislation and lawmaking as well. It's outrageous that CEOs, of your favorite worst fossil fuel corporation are getting millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. So they must be. That must be disallowed, because that's corruption as well. And so we need a wealth fee as well. And that applies to all countries, because it's happening in China, it's happening in India, right?
Yeah, I think there's no question that having a huge disparity between the upper rungs of the economic ladder and the lower rungs makes for a strained society at best, and a fragile state or a failing state in the worst case scenario. So I think part of solving the climate problem involves tackling inequities around the world. And on the population question, some of the easiest ways and the cheapest ways to cut carbon emissions are to educate girls around the world, to make sure girls everywhere are literate, and give them the tools and the information to be able to plan their family size. And study after study shows that when they have the economic resources and they have the educational resources, they will make good choices for their families. And more women in power everywhere tends to be good for the planet. Mm-hmm.
I think, indeed, there is a silent threat of too much stuff, and things that break and things that aren't made to last. That's extremely important, as well as energy efficiency. And as we move forward, it would be wonderful if we could include that in our future. But as we know, we have to stop producing emissions. We need to get to zero emissions fast. We don't necessarily have to do it in 5 years. We can take a little bit more time to do it. It would be better to do it in 5 years. It would be better to do it today, because we already have climate change and we're already feeling it today. But we can work on reducing our fossil fuel infrastructure at 4% or 6% per year. We're not even doing that yet, and then we can at the same rate put in clean technology, renewable technology to take their place, and then get to zero emissions. And we have to do that. We have to find different ways to do that. And we will have we will have cheaper energy, we'll have better energy, and we'll have we'll have a better energy future for sure. I think, was it the at the end of your talk, Janet, that you put that, what's the worst thing that can happen? Cleaner air, better society, what's the worst thing? So we need to do that. And then we need to also look at cradle to grave emissions of our technologies. I mean, we'll be producing other toxins, not just climate change, greenhouse gases. When I was little, they used to scare us with what we were doing to the Great Lakes, because I grew up in the Chicago area, and we would look at how Lake Erie burning and the horrible pollution we were putting into Lake Michigan. Even if we solve our climate change problems, we're still going to have many societal problems with pollution, problems with corrupt governments, and I just solving our climate change will give us a chance to solve all of these other problems. if we don't solve our climate change problem, we can have societal collapse. I don't know if we will have an American government to have a president if we get over 700 parts per million. You know, what type of instability that will cause as there's massive migrations. I mean, our current administration is worried about a few little caravans coming from South America. This is going to be, in Central America, this is going to be way beyond that. You know, and so, and it's going to be caravans of our own people as well. From this country, everybody is our own people, but people from the United States as well. We're going to have caravans of people moving. We've already seen dislocation. So we need to, like I said, we need to find a way, pass laws, carbon, I'm sorry, what was it called? Carbon, I always keep having
Fee-based.
carbon
Rebate.
Fee and
carbon fee, you know, we need to do it all, and we need to do it now. And we need to find a way to motivate people to do it. It would be better if we do not have something like bombing of Pearl Harbor to get us into the war, let's say. And I'm not sure what that is. I think it's everything. Right now it looks like it's a lot of effort, individual effort. Change your natural gas furnace with heat pumps, and buy an electric car, put solar panels on your roof, continue to do your science, do your engineering, be entrepreneurs, be teachers, elect elected officials that will do what we want them to do. And right now it looks like it's everything is what we need to do until entrepreneurship and technological innovation hits where prices go low enough that hopefully this transformation happens and we save ourselves, we are saved despite ourselves.
One other point that we might have forgotten, important, I think could be a very important point. That's not happening in the United States perhaps, but in several other countries in the last several weeks, children have gone on strike. You know, stay home, don't go to school on Friday, and instead go stand in front of the legislature or some place, because, and explicitly saying, you know, you're screwing our future, and we demand that you do something. And if that grows, that just might have a big impact. It's very, very impressive.
What was her name? She was in Sweden. She's 15 years old.
Yeah, she started it, but now it's even Australia,
spreading,
and France and Belgium. It's spread.
Right now in Denver, that's happening right now. Denver Public Schools.
Oh.
Yeah.
So and I think that you're right. The children are seeing this. I know a friend of ours who's an early adopter came to our house with his Leaf 5 or 6 years ago, and my kids were looking at it, and they looked at me and they said, "Why do you have a gas car? Why would you have that stinky, horrible thing? Why don't you have a car with a plug?" You know, that was, and so I think kids see it, and maybe it is action from the kids. I think you're right.
Let me ask,
I think the girl's name is Greta Thunberg.
Greta
Yeah.
Thunberg.
Greta Thunberg, that's right, thanks.
let me ask a couple questions. You can answer any one of these. So it's 4 questions. Answer whichever one you want. Number 1, is there such thing as a way to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere? 2, would eating organic help because of the bad greenhouse gases that are in fertilizers and pesticides? Third, are you saying that did you say that if we really wanted to, we could be using renewable energy 100% in 5 years? Is that realistic if we had full cooperation? Is that really that we have the technology, we know how to do it? And 4, is it too late? And if it's not, when will it be? So one more time. 1, can we suck out the CO2 out of the air? Is there such thing? 2, would eating organic help so that we don't have to use these fertilizers, pesticides, chemicals, insecticides that contribute to fossil fuels, that contribute to greenhouse gases? 3, Are you saying that it really is possible with the will, if we had the will, that in 5 years we could be 100% on renewable energy? And 4, is it already too late? And if it isn't, when will it be? So if you can answer any of those.
Carbon sucking, my understanding is that it's just not there yet. There's been
Trees.
a lot of work on it, but
Trees
in
suck
terms
carbon.
of massive capabilities to do so is just not there yet, but I could be wrong.
No, you're right. We have zero capacity, right? Today we have zero capacity to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So we got...
Trees.
Yeah, I mean, there are natural ways that carbon gets sucked out of the atmosphere, and those are trees, those are algae, plankton. Now, whether we want to seed the oceans with iron and fertilize them so you have massive plankton blooms to suck up carbon dioxide, scientists have looked into that. It seems incredibly dangerous. Think of talking about the possible unintended consequences, but if you want the cheapest, easiest answer, more plants. We'll leave no rooftop left behind act. So all rooftops everywhere could be covered either with green space gardens or solar panels or solar water heaters or something. Use that space to do something good. But as for there's scientific experiments, big things you can erect that suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Incredibly expensive. There's other technologies, the so-called carbon capture and storage, that you can inject the carbon dioxide into the ground or into deep sea formations. Again, not necessarily permanent, very expensive, and why not just avoid putting it there in the first place, leave it in the ground? But no, there's not a cost-effective machine we can put out there that will start taking carbon dioxide any better than nature has already made.
Can I just build on that? I think, obviously there are these things short of geoengineering, which I agree we don't want to pursue for unintended consequences, but reforesting deforested places, carbon soil building through agricultural practices, zero-till, biochar, those things that make sense. And kelp bed farming, as I mentioned earlier, this coast was denuded of its kelp. That would be a storm surge protection measure as well as a carbon sink. We can do all those things very easily today, and they suck a lot of CO2. In fact, forest is probably mathematically the only thing that right now we have that does the numbers. But also, again, short of geoengineering or carbon capture and sequestration, which I think is another tool of obfuscation by the fossil fuel interests, there are ways we can reframe carbon dioxide from being a waste product to being a byproduct, and then using it for other industrial processes. And I realize this could feed the consumption machine and a bigger conversation we've been having here. But for example, my fund has invested in 2 companies in the last 18 months that take CO2, air-captured CO2 from the atmosphere, from the sky, and make useful products out of it. One is focused on graphene, a new compound that you've probably heard of in the scientific literature. So they take it from the atmosphere and turn it into graphene. We found them when they were able to do this. It's called Saratoga. You can look them up at the level of about a thumbnail per day. We've funded them sufficiently to maybe get that to a handful of graphene. Tiny quantities, nowhere near commensurate to the task of what you would put graphene to work to do, which would be in batteries and other industrial and electronic appliances, but it could be a really powerful solve if we were taking CO2 out of the sky and turning it into these things that we don't want to be digging up the ground for and so on. The other one is basically using carbon dioxide as a precursor to industrial chemicals through reformulation chemistry and using electricity as the input. So one of the realities of renewables is because they're variable, you have periods of curtailment, we call it currently, where we have surplus electricity, which I think is kind of a crazy idea that again we have to reframe. But when you're having too much wind and solar power being generated on the grid, rather than shunting it into sand, which we do in some places on Earth today, they take that abundant electricity and they take CO2 and they use it to create chemical reactions which produce other useful chemicals in combination with other raw materials, so they can produce, for example, carbon monoxide or oxygen or other things. That company's called Opus 12. You might have read about them in Vanity Fair. Are they economic? Yes, they are. They actually make those precursor chemicals to industry at a lower cost than where we get those precursor chemicals from for industry elsewhere. They have to prove that they can scale that, but they do. Similarly, the graphene production. But I think this is what I'm talking about. We can unlock the genius of innovation and invention and entrepreneurship, lift all boats, find solutions, and we can see CO2 in the sky as something we have to get rid of, and we do it through productive use.
There's two methods that have been talked about for years and years and years, and one of them is, which has been the most popular, is called bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which is burning wood and stuff. And anyway, the IPCC has sort of favored that, but they changed in the last 1.5C assessment. And they said that the research is saying that we need to move away from that, which I was very happy about. So the other method is direct air capture. Now, there is one example of that. I mean, it's a small scale, but it's happening north of Vancouver in my province of British Columbia. The research was done in the University of Edmonton. And yeah, they're getting CO2 out of the air, and they're making it pay because they're getting enough CO2 out of the air to make a fuel that they can burn. So that's interesting. The criticism of it is that it will require a lot of energy. So we're back in getting more energy, right? But I'm glad that the IPCC is going off the idea of burning up all kinds of wood and trying to capture that.
Yeah, the IPCC scenarios, they just put in huge negative emissions, which is very unrealistic, and they've recognized that. But we have to realize the magnitude of CO2 that we're pumping into the air, 10 gigatons of carbon per year. If you replaced all the forests, put forests back every place where we've deforested, you could get of the order of 100 gigatons, which would be 10 years of our emissions. So that can't solve the problem. We really have to, and in our paper, Young People's Burden, we costed with the most optimistic estimates for the cost, unless there's some magic that people can come up with, but it's unlikely because it takes energy. But it was hundreds of trillions of dollars. If we stay on business as usual, young people are faced with a task of extracting CO2, which will cost hundreds of trillions of dollars, which means it probably won't happen. There are various things you can do that make sense, like preserving old forests and reforesting marginal lands, and even one that I've been a co-author on is adding rock dust as a fertilizer, so that you speed up the weathering process, so the carbon ends up on the ocean floor. But again, the amount that you can get these ways it just makes more sense to phase down our fossil fuel use. It's hard to, it's worth investigating these things, and probably you're going to need to do and want to do a lot of them if they make sense. But you better, in order to keep the job doable, we've got to phase down the emissions.
There's one emission that we've not mentioned, and Dr. Hansen published a paper in 2001 called Alternative Scenario, right, in which he talked about methane and black carbon. And as I understand it, the consensus among the scientists now is that black carbon, which is soot, diesel engines, so big trucks and ships, and also in the poorer countries, they're Instead, they're not being provided with solar cookers and things, so they're burning wood and charcoal and stuff. So as I understand it, and I'd like to hear what Dr. Hansen will know whether that's right, but the consensus is that it's second only to carbon dioxide in the global warming effect. So if it is, and we can control black carbon, that could make a huge difference.
Yeah, that turns out not to be right. You know, the second biggest thing is methane by far, and nitrous oxide is also large. Now, aerosols is a different story, which is not as well quantified. The gases, it's actually very well quantified. We can measure the changes in the gases, and we know that the radiative properties, we can, you know, it's within 10% on each of them. But aerosols is more difficult, and it turns out that many of the black carbon sources are also organic carbon sources. And organic carbon works the other way. It causes a cooling. And so if you reduce the source, you're not actually reducing the warming. And also there's a factor called efficacy, and it turns out that black carbon has a very low efficacy, so that really you shouldn't hope for much there. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't reduce. There's certain places, like diesel engines, produce a lot of black carbon and almost no organic carbon. So it's worth getting rid of that. But we're not going to gain a whole lot that way.
Okay.
There are now lots of companies, probably a dozen worldwide, that are launching satellites so that we can have worldwide Wi-Fi available via satellites. Launching those rockets generates the soot that you guys are talking about.
Yeah, not very much.
Okay. I don't know. I just know it generates soot. And then I just wanted to respond, Steve, to your question about whether it helps to eat organically. I've read that only 1% of food available now is actually organic. So that means it is an incredible privilege to eat anything organically. And I don't know how to shift that except to maintain awareness that if you are able to eat anything organically, that's a great privilege.
Okay, so just to conclude, if everyone would give a 30-second closing statement on any final thoughts, very final thoughts.
Education. We need to educate our population, and I think that's critical.
We need to motivate people to find solutions, and we need to focus on solutions more than ever now, and pass laws, elect officials, and everybody do their part in whatever way they can do it.
Just thanks for you all being here to have a conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to exchange many views with the audience, but with everyone here on the table and all of your life's work, and Steve for hosting us, I think it's really important that we have these discussions. I don't think it's done. I believe that through our combination and ingenious ideas and pursuit of those, an opportunity and a future and a strategy of hope, even if we intellectually cannot find it in ourselves, but deciding to be optimistic, we will be able to get something out of this and have a future that's worth living.
I agree with optimism and having a great vision for the future. I definitely agree with that. I believe that hope is action. We, collectively, I think we're all the hope, right? Because we're doing stuff. We're out there. We're talking about it. But on the other hand, I think the public has to hear that all three greenhouse gases that Dr. Hansen just mentioned, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, they're all increasing extremely rapidly, and that atmospheric CO2 is still accelerating. So we're in a dire Earth emergency.
I think we need to get our democracy to work in an honest way and and that does require also education. The assumption of a democracy is not going to work if the public is not well educated. So that, and that requires getting money out of politics. And frankly, I think we need a third party because our two parties have become so extreme. The extreme elements have taken control of both parties, even though 60% of the public is not in those extremes. So anyway, I don't have a recipe right now, but we've got to work on our democracy.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to.
We're currently in the early stages of a great, enormous transition. It's a transition that can bring us cleaner air, cleaner water, better functioning cities, a chance to appreciate what we need, which might be mobility instead of an automobile, or a way to cook food and feed our family instead of natural gas coming into our house. There's no question that our energy systems in 20 years or less will look nothing like they do today, and I think there's a bright future ahead of us. With regard to broader sustainability, I think there's so many important issues that need to be worked on that every one of us can pick an issue that we're passionate about it, get to work, and we can all remember we vote with our feet, we vote with our wallets, and we also need to vote with our votes. So get politically active and let your leaders know what's important.
I just really want to say thank you to everyone for being part of this discussion, and thank you to Steve very much for hosting this.
Thank you very much.